She didn't resist when they cuffed her, didn't blink when they read the charges, didn't flinch when the bailiff yanked her forward like a warning to the others. She just stood there, calm, unarmed, silent. Inside that small-town courtroom, the temperature shifted. Murmurs stirred among the rows. Another radical. She snapped. "Where's her lawyer?" She wore civilian clothes, a fleece jacket, weathered jeans, scuffed boots. Nothing about her screamed danger, and maybe that's what unsettled them most. The judge raised her gavel. The prosecutor looked smug. The crowd leaned forward. And then, the back doors opened. No announcement, no sound, just the heavy boots of 3 men in dress uniforms, one of them a general. The murmurs died mid-syllable. The prosecutor froze, mid-breath. Even the bailiff took a step back. The general walked straight down the aisle, saluted the defendant, and spoke 4 words that changed everything. "Stand down, Major Ward." Who was she? Why did every badge in the room suddenly look ashamed? And more importantly, why did she let them take her in the first place? If quiet heroes matter to you, the kind who never ask for recognition, but carry the weight anyway, subscribe to This Really Happened. And drop a comment. Where are you watching from? There's something about Anchor Falls, Colorado in the winter. Snow falls in soft, hushed sheets. Roads turn quiet. Mountains hold their breath beneath the fog. And tucked between those mountains, just past the county line, is a place most people forget exists. A shooting range hidden behind old pine and chain-link fencing. That's where Riley Ward, 34, spent most mornings. Alone. She lived just outside town, in a modest A-frame cabin with a rusted chimney and a mailbox that leaned too far to one side. The locals knew her only by habit, not name. To most, she was just that survival lady who taught wilderness skills and marksmanship to teenagers too angry, too wild, or too lost for the system. She was kind, but distant. Efficient, but not unfriendly. Her lessons were always the same. Breathe slower, scan your exits, trust your footing, and above all, never talk more than you have to. The kids liked her. Some of the parents did too. But most folks in Anchor Falls weren't sure what to make of her. No social media, no family visits, no church attendance. Just a woman in gray jackets who moved like she didn't want to be seen. But Frank Mallory, who ran the shooting range, knew better. Frank had spent 27 years as a police captain in Nevada. 2 stints with federal task forces. He'd seen every kind of shooter, rookies, weekend hunters, off-duty officers, angry men with something to prove. But none of them moved like Riley. She never missed. Not in the wind. Not from distance. Not even when shooting cross-angle while kneeling. She adjusted her grip by instinct. She corrected for wind with no instruments. She exhaled on trigger pull, always at the bottom of the breath. And she only ever used one rifle, an old composite bolt action without a scope. No gadgets. No tech. Who teaches someone that kind of patience? Frank once muttered aloud after watching her split a target in 1/4-inch fragments at 400 yards. She didn't answer. She just nodded in his direction, as if to say, some lessons don't come from teachers. Frank didn't press her, didn't ask where she'd trained, didn't mention the way she always faced the parking lot, even when reloading. He just let her be. But one morning in late January, something shifted. The wind was calm, the snow crisp, and Riley was setting up on Lane 9 like always. Then Frank heard it, the soft hum of a drone overhead. Civilian? Maybe. But the pattern was wrong, the speed too slow, the altitude too precise. Riley noticed it too. He could see the slight change in her stance, how her shoulders stopped moving as she assembled the bolt. Then, without hesitation, she lowered the rifle, recased it, and began walking off the line. That's when the two cruisers pulled in. No sirens, no lights, just slow approach, tinted windows, and two uniformed officers with cautious steps. Frank opened the booth door. "Can I help you, fellas?" he called. "Routine ID check," one of them replied. "We've had some anonymous tips about unauthorized weapons training in the area." Frank narrowed his eyes. "This range is licensed. Everyone here signs in." "We're looking for someone specific," the other officer said, already walking toward Riley. They stopped her near the gravel path. "Ma'am," the lead officer began. "Name and permit, please." Riley didn't reach for her bag. She didn't argue. She simply said, "I don't have those with me." "Where's your ID?" "No wallet." "No phone?" "Didn't bring one." The officers exchanged a look. "We're going to have to take you in." Riley turned slightly, just enough to raise both hands, palms open, fingers still. "No resistance," she said calmly, "but I won't be answering questions." Frank watched them cuff her. The metal clicked shut with an odd finality. Riley didn't wince, didn't flinch, didn't even look back. Something wasn't right. She wasn't acting like someone caught. She was acting like someone waiting. By the time the cruiser pulled out, Frank had already pulled out his flip phone, an old Secure Line model he hadn't used in years. He scrolled past names he hadn't seen since retirement, until he found one. "C. Rivas, Atlantic Desk." He tapped the call. It rang twice. Then a voice answered. "Confirming Secure Line?" "It's me," Frank said. "We've got movement. Anchor Falls." "Who?" "A woman. Gray fleece. Bolt-action rifle. No scope. Adjusts wind by instinct. Quiet as stone." Silence. Then, "Are you saying she surfaced?" Frank hesitated. "I'm saying she let them take her." Another pause. Then the line went dead. Riley sat in the back of the cruiser, hands cuffed behind her, expression unreadable. Her breath fogged against the window glass. Outside, the drone continued its lazy arc over the highway. Inside her coat, in a hidden chest pocket, a tiny RFID tag activated as the cruiser passed a mile marker. It transmitted once, then self-destructed, silently. The Anchor Falls Sheriff's Office wasn't built for complexity. It had 3 holding cells, 1 booking desk, and a coffee pot that hadn't been cleaned properly since 2013. The town saw more DUIs than anything else. Maybe a petty theft during the holidays. The rare domestic call that fizzled out before backup arrived. So when they brought Riley Ward in, no one really knew where to put her, mentally or otherwise. She didn't shout. She didn't cry. She didn't ask for a lawyer. She just sat. Hands still cuffed behind her, breath steady, posture like a statue carved from restraint. Name? Silence. Date of birth? Nothing. You do realize refusing to identify yourself is a criminal offense? The booking officer leaned in slightly, expecting at least a twitch, a blink, anything. But Riley's gaze remained level, polite even, but impassible. Like she'd rehearsed this moment 100 times. It unsettled them more than if she'd fought. Deputy Tom Kellerman didn't like puzzles. He'd been in law enforcement long enough to recognize when something didn't fit the mold, and he didn't trust things that didn't fit. He reviewed her belongings with the suspicion of someone who expected danger in every crease. No wallet, no phone, no car keys. Just one small notebook, hand-stitched and weather-worn, filled with strange notations. Grid references. numbers that looked like coordinates, and circles drawn around specific power substations and relay towers around the county. Alongside it, a challenge coin, dark metal, no insignia, edges worn smooth from use. He'd seen one like it before. Once. At a federal interagency briefing in D.C., a coin that meant, "We don't exist." Kellerman clenched his jaw. "She's planning something," he muttered to himself. "Mapping infrastructure, training teens, no paper trail. It's domestic extremism, textbook." He stormed into the sheriff's office. "We need to escalate. Get DHS involved. Hell, maybe even the Bureau." Sheriff Monroe looked up over his glasses. "She hasn't said a word. That's exactly what bothers me." Riley's silence wasn't passive. It was strategic. Even alone in the holding cell, her eyes never stopped moving. She tracked patterns of footsteps, ventilation hums, camera lenses. She knew exactly which corners weren't covered by surveillance and how long the guards took on every rotation. That night, when the overhead lights flickered just once, it wasn't random. She'd memorized the voltage dips, timed the flicker to her footsteps, and when she crossed the cell diagonally, the camera in the upper right-hand corner failed to track. She was testing their system, not escaping it, testing. Meanwhile, 1,000 miles east, a secure federal server pinged a silent alert. A junior analyst noticed it first. A flagged file had been accessed, or rather, attempted. Ravenlight Protocol, eyes only. The analyst tried to open it. The screen blinked once, then locked down the workstation. A red screen pulsed. Chain of command authorization required, level 9. She called her supervisor. The supervisor called a department chief. Within 10 minutes, the line reached the Office of Strategic Anomalies in Arlington, and someone said, "Find out what triggered that ping in Colorado." Back in Anchor Falls, Frank Mallory watched the snow fall outside his window. He hadn't slept much since Riley's arrest. Something about it didn't sit right. Not just the precision of her movements, but the calm. She didn't look like a woman who'd been caught. She looked like a woman right on schedule. Frank dialed an old contact, a number he hadn't used in over a decade. The phone rang 5 times before anyone answered. "Identification?" the voice on the other end asked. "Retired. Range supervisor. Former SecNav liaison." The voice softened. "Still in Colorado?" "Anchor Falls. And I think one of yours just got picked up." "Name?" She wouldn't give one, but the way she breathes when she shoots, that's taught. The way she sights without optics, that's DevGru level. A pause. Then, "What's her cover?" Frank shook his head. "That's what worries me. I don't think she has one anymore." The next morning, Frank arrived at the range just before dawn. The parking lot was empty, snow untouched. But there, parked beside the utility shed, was a black SUV with government plates and a whip antenna reaching for the clouds. Inside, 2 men sat still. Not drinking coffee, not talking, just waiting. Frank didn't wave, didn't approach. He simply opened the gate, walked inside, and began his usual routine. But in his gut, he knew. She wasn't just some lost operative, she was bait, and someone, somewhere, was watching who came to take the hook. Inside the sheriff's office, Deputy Kellerman paced the hallway like a storm trapped indoors. "She's not talking because she's waiting for something," he insisted to the sheriff. "These types always do. Silence is its own kind of threat." "She's in a 10 by 10 cell under constant watch," Sheriff Monroe replied. "We ran her prints. Nothing in state, nothing national. She's a ghost." Kellerman held up the notebook. "She's planning to hit something. Maybe more than one thing. These are targets. Or trail maps, the sheriff countered. We're a hiking town, Tom. No, Kellerman snapped. This is tactical. Look at the spacing. Look at the symbols. This is someone trained. In the interrogation room, Riley sat across from an agent in a Homeland Security windbreaker. His tone was mild, but the undercurrent was sharp. You don't have to say much, he told her. Just give us a name, a lead, a reason not to consider you a threat to national infrastructure. Riley said nothing. He tried again. You could walk out of here today, but silence has consequences. She looked up, her first movement in minutes. Her eyes didn't flash anger, no protest. Just a kind of quiet, exhausting resolve. I've been walking a long time, she said finally. Sometimes silence is the only thing that keeps people alive. They tried trick questions, medical releases, known associate databases. They even ran facial recognition through military archives. Nothing matched. But when they uploaded the scan of the coin they'd found in her pocket, something changed. The system flagged it, then retracted it, then locked out the terminal. The analyst who ran the scan received a call within the hour. Not from DHS, not from the Bureau, but from a department no one in the station had ever heard of. If anyone else asks about that file, refer them to Section 9C, do not log the access point. The analyst hung up and called Kellerman. We triggered something, I don't know what, but it shut me out. Kellerman's eyes narrowed. Then we're in deeper than we thought. That afternoon, while Riley was being moved for another round of questioning, she noticed something new. An officer, late 40s, shoulder holster worn left-handed, but something else, a wire leading from his collar to a throat mic, too thin to be standard issue. She didn't acknowledge him, but she adjusted her step slightly, just enough to shift the escort's rhythm. As they walked past the main security monitor, the feed blinked, not off, just enough to lose 3 seconds of visual. That was all she needed. She wasn't mapping the station anymore. She was monitoring the people inside it. Back at the range, Frank watched as a second SUV arrived, this one with no plates at all. The men who stepped out didn't ask for entry. They simply walked the perimeter once, checked their watches, then returned to the vehicle. One of them glanced toward Frank's booth and nodded, respectfully. Not as a stranger, but as someone who recognized a fellow sentry. Frank exhaled through his nose. The game had changed. This wasn't about Riley anymore. This was about who was coming for her. That night, snow fell harder. The roads turned to powder. In the cell, Riley sat against the wall, counting seconds beneath her breath. At exactly 0200, she stood up and walked to the far corner. The camera blinked once. When it resumed, she was sitting again. A test, nothing more. But someone was watching the footage, and whoever it was, they saw what she'd done. They weren't watching for escape attempts. They were watching for timing. The next morning, Sheriff Monroe was called into his office. 2 men were waiting. One wore a Department of Justice badge. The other didn't offer ID, just a black folder and a calm voice. You need to transport your detainee to the county courthouse within the hour, he said. For what? The sheriff asked. Arraignment. Local jurisdiction. I didn't request it. Doesn't matter. The man handed over a printed court order, signed by a federal judge whose name Monroe didn't recognize. She's about to be someone else's problem. Outside, the first light of day painted the courthouse steps in cold gray. But parked across the street, engine off, windows tinted, sat a black SUV with military tags. A whip antenna arced upward, bent slightly from snow buildup. And inside, someone waited. motionless. Watching the door, watching for a signal, watching the moment when silence became signal. The courtroom smelled of wood polish and recycled heat. A relic from another time. Before cybercrime, before drones, before national threat levels were color-coded. Judge Lenora Baines adjusted her glasses, scanned the docket, and frowned. The room buzzed with quiet tension. Locals filled the gallery, some curious, others uncomfortable. At the defense table sat Riley Ward, wrists cuffed, ankles chained. Still, upright, completely composed. No outburst, no plea bargain, no motion filed, just silence. The public defender beside her flipped nervously through an empty folder. "Your Honor," he stammered, "we still have not received cooperation from my client. I request a postponement for further psychiatric evaluation." Before the judge could reply, the prosecutor rose, a young, ambitious ADA who clearly smelled opportunity. "Your Honor," he said confidently, "this is not a case of confusion. This is a case of calculated evasion. The defendant was apprehended with an unregistered military-grade weapon, a coded notebook mapping critical infrastructure, and refused to identify herself or comply with basic law enforcement procedure. This isn't about due process. This is about public safety." He let the words hang in the air like a verdict. She has no history, no digital footprint, no job, no family. But she has knowledge that suggests either foreign training or domestic radicalization. I am recommending she be held under Section 12 of the Patriot Reinforcement Clause. Judge Baines pursed her lips. "Is Homeland Security present?" A man in a suit stood from the back. "Yes, Your Honor. We've submitted an interagency report detailing her risk profile. We believe she is actively involved in planning or supporting critical infrastructure sabotage." "And the FBI?" Another suit stood. "We have an overlapping investigation, possibly connected to a surveillance network out of Sanford Ridge." The judge sighed. "Of course you do." Riley said nothing. She sat like a shadow, her eyes fixed not on the judge, not on her accusers, but somewhere far beyond the wood-paneled walls, as if counting seconds, as if waiting for something very specific. Then it happened. The doors at the back of the courtroom creaked open, not slammed, not burst, just opened. 3 men entered, dressed in full military service uniform, medals, stripes, authority etched into every thread. The room went still. Every head turned. Even the judge sat straighter. In the center walked a man with silver hair, sharp posture, and a face weathered by combat and command. No name tag, no introduction. He didn't need one. 4-star General Everett Langley hadn't set foot in a civilian courtroom in over a decade. And when he moved, people moved aside. No one told him to approach the bench. He simply did. In his gloved hands, a sealed black envelope marked with a red stripe and a government crest few in the room had ever seen. The bailiff hesitated, then stepped forward and passed the envelope to the judge. She broke the seal, unfolded the pages, and as she read, her face changed from confusion to recognition to something like guilt. When she looked up again, her voice wasn't as steady. In light of this classified documentation, issued by the Department of Defense under National Defense Priority Alpha, all charges against the defendant are hereby dismissed, effective immediately. A murmur spread like a shockwave. No one in that courtroom understood what they'd just heard, but they felt it. The judge continued, "This matter is no longer under civilian jurisdiction. The record of today's proceedings is sealed under Directive Order 793J. This court is adjourned." Then the general did something no one expected. He turned to Riley, stepped toward her, and said, loud enough for the entire room to hear, "Major Ward, your work is appreciated. We apologize for the inconvenience." The bailiff moved to remove her cuffs. His hands shook. Officers who had stood moments ago with suspicion in their eyes now stood with their backs straighter, no longer accusers, but witnesses. Even the Homeland Security agent lowered his eyes. Riley stood slowly. The shift was immediate. The silence wasn't just compliance. It was respect. The way she stood now was different. No longer folding in on herself. No longer invisible. Her bearing was unmistakable. Military, elite, dangerous, and fully in control. Then, for the first time since her arrest, she spoke clearly. "Thank you, sir. The operation remains intact. The asset was not exposed. The local containment held." The general nodded. That was the objective. Her eyes scanned the gallery, stopping briefly on Kellerman, who sat stunned, hollowed out by a realization he couldn't yet name. "They were watching me," she said quietly, more to herself than anyone else. "And now they'll pivot, because they think I was compromised." All of it was planned. She needed to go dark. She needed to send a message to the ones watching. She needed to disappear in plain sight. The general placed a hand on her shoulder. "The debrief will wait. First, let's get you home." Riley nodded, then turned and walked out of the courtroom. This time, not in chains, but under full escort. Behind her, the room stood still. Not because they were told to, but because some names carry silence heavier than applause. Outside the courthouse, the storm had passed. Sunlight broke through the clouds, casting a soft gleam on the black SUV parked just beyond the steps. Engine humming low, windows darkened. Two uniformed officers stood waiting beside it, eyes trained forward. Formal, but not stiff. Riley stood beside the general, now out of her restraints and dressed in a simple gray coat handed to her by one of the men. Her demeanor was unreadable, still composed, but with something quieter underneath. Not relief, not pride, something closer to release. Sheriff Monroe approached, hat in hand, a mix of confusion and respect weighing down his voice. "General, with all due respect, we've been treating her like a suspect for 2 days. She wouldn't identify herself, wouldn't speak. Hell, we thought she was planning an attack." General Langley offered a tight nod. "You weren't wrong to do your job, Sheriff, but you were operating without the full picture. She was mapping our grid. She was protecting it." Deputy Kellerman, now visibly shaken, took a cautious step forward. "Sir, I filed for federal charges. I pushed for enhanced interrogation. If she'd said something, anything." Riley turned to face him. "No apology necessary," she said softly. "You followed protocol. I needed you to. If you hadn't done your part, they wouldn't have believed the cover. And the network watching me would have stayed buried." Kellerman swallowed hard. "So, it was all part of the plan?" She nodded. "The mission wasn't over. I had to disappear without going off-grid." "Why not just come to us?" he asked. Her reply was steady. "Because the people we were tracking had eyes inside your department, inside the courts, inside the press. If I gave you special treatment, or whispered who I was, we would have lost everything." Frank Mallory stood just beyond the steps, arms folded, watching from a distance. Riley caught his eye. A silent nod passed between them, the kind shared between those who've seen things they'll never explain. Frank didn't wave, didn't smile. He just stood, letting the weight of her choices settle into something that resembled understanding. The general opened the SUV door. "Let's move," he said. "DC is waiting, and Operation Ravenlight's next phase starts at 500. Riley took one last look at the courthouse, the people, the sky. Then she stepped into the vehicle and disappeared behind the tinted glass. The engine growled once, then rolled forward, tires crunching softly over wet gravel. Inside the courthouse, the gallery slowly began to empty. No one spoke. Not the agents, not the judge, not the press. Because how do you report a story that's been sealed, redacted, and rewritten by silence? How do you explain a woman who entered a courtroom in chains and left it saluted? Far away, in a clean room at a secure facility, a file folder was placed into a locked cabinet marked Raven Light, Closed Phase 1. Inside it, transcripts, surveillance photos, and a single line written in pen on the final page. Target cell compromised by theatrical insertion. Subject's integrity confirmed. Counter-intel network disengaged. And somewhere beyond what most people see, beyond what headlines allow, beyond what policy defines, there are people like Riley Ward, people who don't protest, don't explain, don't ask to be believed, because they aren't working for applause. They're working to make sure the rest of us never have to know what was almost lost. 2 days after the courtroom emptied, a small, unmarked package arrived at the Anchor Falls shooting range. Frank Mallory found it on the front bench, nestled in yesterday's snow, sealed in brown paper with no return address. Inside, a military-grade spotting scope, sleek and matte black, along with a handwritten note on stiff gray paper. "Keep watching. R.W." No signature, just initials. But Frank knew the handwriting and the implication. He wasn't just being thanked. He was being recruited, not with a badge, not with clearance, but with trust. That same week, Deputy Kellerman received a call from Washington. At first, he thought it was a mistake or a reprimand, but the voice on the other end didn't scold. It invited. He was flown to D.C. under non-disclosure protocol, escorted through layers of glass and steel until he stood in a briefing room more secure than anything he'd imagined. Inside were men and women who didn't wear uniforms, but carried weight in every word. They reviewed his report, the mistakes, the misreadings, the consequences, and then they asked him a question. If you had to do it again, knowing what you know now, what would you change? Kellerman didn't hesitate. I'd listen more, assume less, ask better questions. A pause, a nod, a new clearance badge placed in his hand. Good answer. Let's make sure the next time goes better. 3 months passed. Winter gave way to thaw, Anchor Falls shook off the frost, and the shooting range returned to quiet routine. Locals returned with deer rifles and hunting vests, laughing too loudly, missing every third shot. Frank went back to oiling benches, adjusting targets, minding his own business, just like always. But then, one Tuesday morning, someone new arrived. A young woman, early 20s, soft-spoken, civilian. She wore a campus hoodie, said she was part of a college marksmanship team doing independent drills for her thesis. Her paperwork was in order, her demeanor polite, but her form flawless. Too flawless. Frank watched from the booth as she set up. No scope, no wind meter. She measured with instinct, adjusted with breath. Her rifle didn't flinch. She hit 5 targets in 5 seconds. One of them placed at a diagonal just shy of 450 yards. She logged her results into a small notebook. Clean handwriting, no flair. Everything about her was ordinary, except none of it was. That evening, after the last light had dipped below the ridge, Frank sat in the office and pulled out a business card from the drawer. The one Riley had left him. No name, just a number. And a phrase scratched faintly on the back. "If you see it again, call." He dialed. A voice answered on the first ring. Male. Calm. "Identification?" Frank replied without hesitation. "Stillwater, Blue Ridge," a pause. "Go ahead," Frank kept his voice low. "New shooter, early 20s, exceptional technique. Claims college training, probably not lying, but not telling the whole story either." "What's your read?" "She's either one of yours, testing me, or someone you haven't found yet." The voice replied, "We'll look into it." And then, more quietly, "Thank you for continuing to watch the door." Frank hung up. Then he walked back out to lane 9 and ran his hand across the wood where Riley used to line her shots. Still smooth, still centered. He didn't know if he'd ever see her again. But the echoes of her presence still lingered in the grain of the wood, in the wind that passed across the range, in the silence between every trigger pull. Some people vanish with time. Others leave trails for the right eyes to follow. A week later, the young woman returned to the range, but this time she wasn't alone. A man stepped out of the truck beside her. Mid-40s, neutral jacket, military haircut. He didn't carry a weapon, but everything about the way he moved said, "I don't need to." Frank watched from the booth, silent. After they finished their session, more practice, more polish, more deliberate mistakes meant to look accidental, the man approached. He extended a hand. "Mr. Mallory," he said evenly. "I'm with the evaluation division, assessment lead. Just wanted to thank you for calling it in." Frank nodded, shaking his hand. "She's one of yours then?" "She's in consideration. We put people through field stressors. One of them is anonymity. This range is useful for that." Frank smiled faintly. "Because it looks like it doesn't matter." "Exactly." They stood in silence for a beat. Then Frank asked the question he'd held in his chest for months. "Is Riley still active?" The man paused, not out of hesitation, but calculation. "That name hasn't been used in a while." And just like that, the conversation shifted, not closed, but redirected. A chapter turned quietly in the dark. Weeks passed. The young woman didn't return. But one morning, Frank found another package at the gate. No return label, no markings, same handwriting. Inside, a custom-built encrypted radio, polished and compact, and beside it, a pair of sighting tools used only by military reconnaissance teams. Folded between them, a single note. "You'll know them when you see them. RWBU." No signature, just the initials, and they carried more gravity than a full name ever could. Frank placed the radio beneath the counter, beside the old scope Riley had once trained with. Then he walked out to lane 9 and adjusted the targets, just a little farther than regulation. Because someone new might show up tomorrow. Or not. That wasn't the point. The point was the gate remained open, not to just anyone, but to those who moved differently, breathed differently, chose silence over recognition. He wasn't guarding a range anymore. He was guarding a threshold, because some serve in uniform, others serve in silence, but a few, a rare few, stand still just long enough to help the next one move forward. And some of them, like Riley Ward, don't disappear. They become invisible by design, not to hide, but to protect. So maybe the next time you meet someone quiet, someone who looks like they're watching more than speaking, someone whose stillness feels deliberate, not unsure, maybe ask yourself, Who trained them to disappear so that others could remain safe? Have you ever crossed paths with someone who turned out to be far more than they appeared? A mentor, a stranger, a shadow that shaped you? Drop your story in the comments, because sometimes the people we remember most are the ones who never needed to be seen. And if stories like this speak to something in you, subscribe to This Really Happened, for tales that whisper where others shout, for truths you feel, not just hear.